And I see I've got several of my colleagues from work and my other friends have joined in. I'm so happy to see that you've joined in. We're going to continue our history lesson today on freedom. Hydesville Church knows we have discussed the Dred Scott case. We've discussed the Pilgrims. We've discussed how the colony of Maryland was formed. Today, we're going to continue on with freedom. We're going to incorporate in the sermon some contemporary activity on Black Lives Matter and what my friend Captain Washington Johnson has just published in the Adventist Review. So let's take a look at, all right. So my sermon is titled Freedom, a Duty to Act. And today is the day that we celebrate the country's independence, July 4, 2020. There'll be a grand celebration throughout the country, tempered a bit by COVID-19. We'll talk a little bit about that. So Declaration of Independence, it has these words in the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and that's my typo, evident, that all men, and that includes women, are created equal, that they are endowed by their unalienable right, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as we've discussed before, the second clause, that all men are created equal, that their creator has given them unalienable rights. That means rights that cannot be taken away. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Bill of Rights to the First Amendment, is the First Amendment to the US Constitution reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So recently here in Washington, the nation's capital, outside of the People's House, the White House, protesters gathered peaceably to protest police brutality, excessive force, and the loss of life, innocent life. And as you see in the top left, the president walked over to St. John's Church, which is known as the President's Church. He didn't go there to speak. He went there for a photo opportunity. And you can look this up. This is in the historical record. The protesters who were peaceably gathered in Lafayette Square, which is a public space where protest is permitted, were forcefully evicted from the square through the use of, there you can see in the picture to the right, you can see smoke. There was a chemical pepper spray that was applied to a peaceful crowd to push the crowd back so the president could walk across the street, hold up a Bible, and then walk back. You see what the First Amendment to the United States Constitution says. The right of the people peaceably to assemble. Now, Patrick Henry is considered one of the founding fathers of the nation. And in fact, he was known as the best orator in the colonies, and if not the best orator in American history. He provided the spark to stand up against the tyranny of England and its king for freedom for the colonists. So he is famous for his line, I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Give me liberty or give me death. So he knew the value of freedom. He would rather die than to lose his freedom. Yet Patrick Henry owned slaves. And he believed that getting rid of slavery, as you see the quote there, is the furthest advance we can make toward justice. The purity of our religion, what religion is that? That's Christianity, is at variance with that law which warrants slavery. However, as I noted, he was conflicted. And he says, I cannot justify owning slaves. So a man for whom liberty was so important that he would rather die, he owned slaves, and he died owning 67 slaves. George Washington, considered the father of the nation. In fact, some of the founding fathers wanted to make him a king. He says, no, that's not what we're going to do. We're coming out of that. When he died, he owned 123 slaves. And when his wife died, those slaves were to be freed. Mount Vernon, in its manifest, had 317 slaves working on the plantation. And out of those 317, 123 were owned by Washington and his wife, Martha. And as I noted, on his death, he freed those slaves. The descendants of one of those slaves is my friend. His name is Greg Holland. On his death, in his will, Washington had these slaves freed. And my friend Greg's forefather actually became quite successful, purchased property, in fact, brought a lawsuit against the Union Army. The Union Army camped in one of his fields, and they took firewood that this slave had in his field. And he sued, but at that time, he could not sue in his own name, and he had to have a white man stand in his stead to file a lawsuit. So he filed a lawsuit for the Union Army camping in his field. He ended up winning his lawsuit. So the father of the nation, a Christian, held slaves. So now we come to the Civil War. On the left, you see Robert E. Lee, Confederate States of America. Abraham Lincoln offered to Lee the command of the Union Army, but Lee declined because he could not take up arms against his home state of Virginia. On the top right, you see an artist's rendition of Lee on his horse. That's his famous horse. The name of the horse is Traveler. And on the left, you see Stonewall Jackson. And behind Stonewall Jackson's horse, you see the flag of the Confederacy, the stars and the bars. On the bottom, you see an aerial view of the statue in Richmond that is erected in Lee's honor. 10,000 people came out for the installation of this memorial. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So Lee graduated from West Point, declined the offer to command, and chose to take up arms against the Union. That's treason, and you're considered traitors today. And if you're following the news, the Department of Defense is looking to rename 10 bases that are named after Confederate generals. And what's interesting, the Civil War started with shots fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Confederate general, and I know my friend Eric Person is online, and Eric, jump in and correct me, was General Beauregard. General Beauregard ordered the Union base at Fort Sumter to surrender. The Union commander refused, and General Beauregard fired cannon shots on Fort Sumter, which started the Civil War. There is an Army base named after General Beauregard. The commander who refused to surrender Fort Sumter, there's no military base named after him today. The 13th Amendment to the US Constitution, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, my friend Captain Johnson told me the other days, we had a chat. He told me that Mississippi only recently ratified the 13th Amendment. Mississippi was the last state in the Union to ratify this amendment to the Constitution. You need 3/4 of the states to ratify an amendment to the Constitution. So there you see the ratification took place in 1995. Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. 100 years later, Mississippi, the state of the stars and bars, ratifies this amendment to the Constitution. And due to some oversight, Mississippi did not formally submit its ratification to the Archivist of the United States. And it so happened that a minority gentleman was watching the movie Lincoln, and in it, he saw this thing about ratification of the 13th Amendment, and he did some research, and he found out that the Secretary of State in Mississippi never submitted to the Archivist of the United States Mississippi's formal ratification of the 13th Amendment. That only took place following his research and contacting the Secretary of State. That took place in 2013. So effectively, until 2013, Mississippi had not prohibited slavery. Now, it would have been in conflict with the US Constitution, but that's just something that I find quite interesting. And I'm glad my friend Washington brought that to my attention. So turning to my friend Washington, he took me to the city of Birmingham, Alabama, from where his mother's side of the family comes. And on the top left, you'll see a memorial there. That memorial is to 4 Black girls who were murdered by, today you would call them terrorists, by folks who were opposed to integration. They were killed in church on a Sunday morning in the 16th Street Baptist Church, which was Martin Luther King Jr.'s church. And on the other side, little girls, just like you folks, I heard that there were 2 kids in attendance today. Think of that, little children in church on Sabbath, and a bomb in a church, a house of worship, kills these worshipers. Brutality and hatred. On the top right, you see Rosa Parks, images of Rosa Parks holding up a number. That's her arrest number. Why was she arrested? She was arrested because she refused to get up and give her seat to a white man, because that was the law in Jim Crow South for segregation. Rosa Parks became an American hero and laid in state in the US Capitol. And I had the honor of paying respects, 3 o'clock in the morning, filing by the US Capitol. The line was long, it took that long to get in, and there were still people in line at 3 o'clock in the morning. On the bottom right, you'll see some graphic images. And don't forget what we read in the First Amendment, the right of the people to peaceably assemble, and the right of the people for freedom of speech and to ask for redress from their government. What you see in the bottom are police forces in the South, led by Bull Connor, where he unleashes the dogs on these protesters. Look at the gentleman on the bottom right. He's just walking. And there are 2 officers. One officer there is unleashing what looks like a German Shepherd who's tearing off the man's pants. And there you'll see in the bottom left, look at that woman crossing the street. There's no weapons in her hand. Her fists are not clenched. And there's a policeman with his arm raised and a baton with what looks to be a German Shepherd. And what are the people doing? Are they throwing rocks? Are they throwing bottles? Are they fighting? Do they have weapons? No. They're standing up for their rights, the rights of freedom. This is the statue of Robert E. Lee as it looks today in Richmond on Monument Avenue. There, someone has projected on the monument an image of George Floyd being an innocent civilian who was killed by a police officer leaning on his neck with his knee for 8+ minutes. And George Floyd said, "I can't breathe." Bystanders tried to intervene. There were at least 2 other police officers with the officer who was leaning on his neck while George Floyd was restrained. And he says, "I can't breathe," and he was murdered. There, someone has painted on Robert E. Lee's horse traveler, BLM, Black Lives Matter. On the right, and you'll see an image, that's me standing in front of the statue, and you will see there is some graphic language spray painted on the memorial. And around the bottom of the memorial, there are images of African Americans who have been murdered by the police, and a write-up on each name, and you will recognize the names: Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many others. So here, the pride of the Confederacy, the heart of the Confederacy is Richmond, Virginia. Monument Avenue, there's memorials to Stonewall Jackson taken down. A Confederate naval officer, I believe Maury, taken down. And this statue, there's a court injunction preventing its removal. And the governor of Virginia has committed to taking down the statue. Now, what's interesting in contrast, I know that I have a friend who is a descendant of one of George Washington's slaves. I also have a friend who's a descendant of Robert E. Lee. And we had a group of federal agents. We went down to Miami after Hurricane Katrina the following year to do training. And I went out walking after our session, and I saw my friend Bob Lee on the street, and he was standing next to a memorial of Robert E. Lee. We talked about it. I took his picture in front of the memorial. He was very proud of that. And now, decades later, it would have been unthinkable for statues of Robert E. Lee to be coming down. The country has changed. People realize that change is necessary. How long did it take for Mississippi? 100+ years to ratify that amendment. And a statue that 10,000 people came to see, now more than 10,000 people come to see its removal. Here's 3 texts from the Bible. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. Learn to do good, seek justice, help the oppressed, defend the cause of orphans, fight for the rights of widows. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in the time of trouble. Amos 5:24, Isaiah 1:17, Psalms 9:9. So what are we to do with these verses? We know what's right and wrong. We have the freedom to act. Our friends in Hong Kong, that's no longer the case. The Chinese Communist Party, and as you know, I hate communism, the Chinese Communist Party recently enacted revisions to Article 3, the basic law for the city of Hong Kong. Hong Kong was guaranteed in its treaty between China and Great Britain that the citizens of Hong Kong would have freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, all the things that we have in America. Of course, communists are interested, as my friend Hung Lee, who's online, who knows he escaped from Vietnam. Communists are not interested in freedom. They're interested in controlling the people, limiting their information, and skimming off the value of the workers' labor. And so that's what China has done. Instead of waiting the requisite 50 years to give Hong Kong its freedom under one country, 2 systems, China has reneged, because that's what authoritarian states do. What freedom you have today may be gone tomorrow. You need to exercise your rights. Hong Kongers came out in peaceful protests, the Umbrella Revolution, and the Chinese cracked down, but they couldn't crack down like they did in Tiananmen Square, where they shot and ran over students who were protesting and who had erected their goddess of freedom. Communism and democracy, they don't go together. Freedom of conscience and communism do not go together. So when you have freedom in this country, take advantage of it and exercise it, or you will lose it. So my friend, Captain Johnson, on the right, you see him at his promotion ceremony. He's being promoted from commander to the rank of captain. And to the left is his commanding officer. That's the commanding officer at the time, General Reynold Hoover, who at the time was a deputy commander of U.S. Northern Command, which is a very high-ranking official. And in between them, you see Admiral Barry Black, who serves as the chaplain of the United States Senate. So Washington just had an article published last night in the Adventist Review. There's a link for you if you want to read the full article, and I recommend it to you. So Washington writes, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, 100 years from the beginning of the American Civil War and 5 generations removed from slavery. So he writes, how shall we support the cause of righteousness and justice? We just read the Bible text, And he offers 8 points. Begin by taking a stand on your knees. That is prayer. 2, demonstrate compassion to all humanity, regardless of color, creed, race, religion, sexual orientation, gender, economic status, academic achievement. Exercise your right and civic duty to vote. I was arguing with one of my friends yesterday who wasn't planning to vote, and she's an African American. I said, your people suffered and died to get the right to vote. You need to exercise that right, regardless of who you want to vote for. That's not on me, that's on you. Be change agents. Don't be neutral. Take action. You have the freedom, you have the rights, exercise them. As Christians, we should not sit silent. We should not sit on our hands. We should not be idling while others are standing at the forefront, crying out for justice and doing what is right. Advocate for justice. After all, Christ came to save us, to redeem us from sin. It is incumbent on us to lighten the suffering of the oppressed, to plead the cause of the widow, the unity within our nation. Should we not just take the liberty that we have, the freedom that we have, the economic benefits that we have, and just relax and take it easy? That's not what God calls us to do. That is not why God has given us an opportunity to live in the greatest country on earth with the greatest freedoms on earth. Dialogue, talk to others. They have a different perspective. I cannot understand fully the experience of my African American friends, like April and Chieftain and Eric. Likewise, my friend Hung, who escaped from Vietnam and communism, and his family lost their lucrative business. I cannot fully understand that. Likewise, there are people who have different perspectives with which we don't agree. It is incumbent on us to help them to understand our position and to learn as to why they hold their position. Our job is not to convince them. Our job is to listen to them and share with them what we believe and model that following the nature of Christ. Commit ourselves to love and work together through God's almighty power. And that's self-explanatory. So as Christians living in the greatest land on earth with freedom on this day where we celebrate independence, what can you do? What will you do? George Floyd cried out as much as he could that he could not breathe. You can breathe. You can speak. You can march. You can lift your hand to help the poor and needy. You can put your hand in your wallet to support those who are struggling during COVID-19. I heard our singer say that she's been without work for a while. She's not the only one. People are suffering. My friend Ken Flemmer at the Adventist Community Services of Greater Washington has seen a tremendous increase in people coming for food and for assistance. Diapers, donations have gone up, volunteers have gone up, but the need is still great. So you may not want to march in Richmond, in Washington, in Baltimore, but there's other ways that you can lift up the cause of the poor and needy, where you can follow Christ's example to help set the captive free. Isn't that what we should be considering? Isn't that what we should be doing as we celebrate this day of freedom from tyranny and oppression? May God bless you.